Hi, my name is Lydia Kotowski, and I am a Policy and Regulatory Affairs Manager with the California Telehealth Resource Center. I am very excited to share a legislative update with you today around all things artificial intelligence from this past legislative year. We will touch on a few key happenings in Congress and then dive into a few important pieces of legislation that made it through the California legislature this year and were signed by Governor Newsom over the course of the past month. So before we get started, I just want to ensure that everyone knows what we present today does not constitute legal advice. Everything is meant purely for educational purposes, and we strongly encourage you to reach out to your own billing, compliance, and legal teams to assess whether and how any of the laws touched on today impact your organization. Before we get into specific pieces of legislation, we just want to provide a high-level overview of where we've been, what happened this year, and where we think things are headed next. So from 2021 to this year, 2020-25, we have seen a rapid uptick in the quantity of legislation introduced and enacted across pretty much every single state. California is a prime example of this trend. Looking at 2021, there were just 9 pieces of legislation introduced that year that included the phrase artificial intelligence. Fast forward to 2024 and 2025, and we had 60 plus pieces of legislation introduced each year, and more than 20 pieces of legislation actually enacted each year. So in just a 2-year period, we had more than 50 pieces of legislation, including the phrase artificial intelligence, signed into law. This means that organizations in the state doing business in the state or that impact consumers in the state had to really parse through a pretty substantial quantity of legislation to see what applied to them, what didn't, and what they needed to do to comply. For smaller and less resourced organizations, this kind of analysis can be particularly burdensome. So while just looking at a single year in isolation may not seem that daunting, if this trend continues, the compliance burden and legal interpretation burden for small and lower resourced organizations could grow exponentially along with the quantity of legislation. So looking at Congress first to see what's happening at the federal level, Congress has had multiple hearings addressing the topic of artificial intelligence and introduced several pieces of legislation that include the phrase artificial intelligence. However, very few of these are directly impactful to healthcare, and the handful that have been signed into law are not impactful to healthcare, but do signal that Congress is paying attention to the artificial intelligence industry and slowly ramping up its approach of how to regulate or not regulate artificial intelligence. We saw with the budget earlier this year, potential preemption of state laws. While that was ultimately not enacted, there is currently a bill introduced that would revive that idea of preemption. So continuing to watch what's happening in Congress will be really important, especially for states like California, where there are lots of artificial intelligence laws on the books. So what happened this year in California? We had more than 30 bills that our organization actively tracked as being potentially impactful to healthcare. And what you see here on the slide behind me is a representation of a handful of laws that were ultimately enacted that we think are of particular interest, as well as one bill that will make a reappearance next session. So the first category of legislation that we watched were for regulatory frameworks. And AB 853, California AI Transparency, requires disclosures of provenance data by certain AI developers of certain artificial intelligence tools and systems. So one to watch there as it is sort of straddles the line between a regulatory framework and a disclosure law. AB 1018 was not signed into law. It was held for next session back in September. But this, if enacted, would be a really robust regulatory framework that has requirements for both developers and deployers of artificial intelligence systems across most industries, including healthcare. So this would be a very impactful bill that would have pretty significant compliance obligations, as well as enforcement mechanisms to ensure that entities needing to comply do so. Looking next at our disclosure and transparency legislation, we have AB 489, which is meant to protect consumers and ensure that if they are interacting with artificial intelligence tools, that they do not think that information they are receiving is coming from a duly licensed or certified medical practitioner, when in fact it is coming from an artificial intelligence system with no such license or certification. SB 243 is a chatbots bill, and while this looks predominantly at companion chatbots, which could have implications for things like mental health chatbots, the really interesting thing about this piece of legislation is its liability provision. It does have some specific consumer rights granted in the liability and enforcement provision, so encourage people to take a look at that, as that could signal where the legislature is headed in terms of thinking about consumer protections and rights with regards to artificial intelligence. Finally, we have a few updates within the California government and how it may be exercising oversight over artificial intelligence, in particular, AB 979, the California Cybersecurity Integration Center Artificial Intelligence, requires a playbook by 2027 that would include some mandatory mechanisms for state entities as well as entities that contract with state entities to comply with. We don't necessarily know what those mechanisms are going to look like at this point, but definitely one to watch if you yourself are from a state entity or you are with an organization that contracts with state entities. We also have a whistleblower law that was enacted, so seeing some protections there for people who are raising red flags about the development or deployment of certain kinds of artificial intelligence tools. So as you review legislation within your organization that was enacted this year and in future years, a few things to keep in mind to help with that analysis is really rooted in looking very carefully at the definitions included in the bill and really what the purpose of the bill is. Those two pieces, definitions and purpose, can help determine whether or not something is going to apply to your organization or to the specific artificial intelligence tools that your organization is developing or deploying. Categories to really think about include scope, specs, risk, and coverage. All of this feeds into how a piece of legislation may or may not impact your organization and can help with internal conversations around things like governance and compliance to make sure that AI is being used in a safe and responsible manner while still encouraging innovation. That brings us to the end of our Spark session today. We hope this provided some insights into the 2025 legislative session around artificial intelligence laws. And we thank you for joining us at the California Telehealth Resource Center. Thank you.